Salutations to the Truth Core, whoever or wherever you may be on the planet. Here I am with installment 5 in Mythology 101. Title is, What Makes a Myth Sacred? Something I can tell you about my calling in comparative mythology is that it runs on parallel tracks. There are moments when you investigate the material, which might be called the Materia mythica, and that is the inventory of all the myths of all cultures and races in the world over time. But there are also moments when you step aside from the actual material and you need to look at the method that you're using to handle the material. So these are moments that arise occasionally, and now is one of these moments. What I'm going to say now, however, is not a digression. There are no digressions in this course. When it comes to digressions, holy moly, I could tell you a thing or two about digressions. I had to climb over Joseph Campbell to get to the top of this mountain. He's down there somewhere below, sitting on a beautiful ledge, surrounded by 20 or 30 college girls attending his course at Sarah Lawrence, where he taught. And I respect him enormously, and I also respect him for stopping on that ledge. And I often picture him sitting there with a semicircle of these college girls sitting around him, rich college girls at that exclusive institution. They've all got on these beautiful cashmere sweaters and silk blouses. And you can see their nipples getting hard as the professor regales them with mythological tales. So I don't blame him for stopping there, but I can tell you that his digressions are insufferable. Just take creative mythology, for instance. It's one thick volume. I once took the time to note the digressions in that book, and I think they run to sometimes 40 pages. I think the longest one was 40-something pages. Campbell disguises his digressions with a word, a musical term, intermezzo. So when you see that term, if you're reading creative mythology, be prepared for a 40-page digression. And Campbell was a second-rater compared to C.G. Jung. Now, I've read the entire works of C.G. Jung and some of his books on alchemy more than once. I also took the time to plot the digressions, and I think the longest digression I ever found in C.G. Jung was something like 140 pages. But there are no digressions in this course, my friends. I am merely shifting tracks for a moment to look at the method. There is a forensic method required for the study of creative mythology. You can compare it to the forensics that are used to investigate a crime scene. If you go into a crime scene and you have no training in forensics, you may mess up the scene, and you're certainly not going to detect and interpret the clues, the evidence correctly. One thing that's been troubling me is my use of the term myth. And I realize that some people flinch at the use of this term. I'm using it as a professional, but that is not the common case. There is a conventional or everyday connotation of the word myth, and you know, of course, what that is. So in the vernacular, myth means what? Well, it means a lie, a fabrication, a false story. That is not what it means in the professional sense. For instance, in conventional parlance, you hear expressions like this: the myth of male menopause, or the myth of white supremacy, the myth of white privilege. Now, some people would say white privilege is not a myth. It's not a fabrication or something made up that doesn't really exist. What are other common examples? Say the myth of colonial domination. Many of the so-called myths that are operating today, interestingly, are related to race and to the achievements or actions of certain races through history. There are quite a few myths connected to the white race, as you know, and they're all aimed or designed to condemn the white race. Just take note of that. Or you could say, going to another meme, what was that film that came out? Oh yeah, Wakanda. You know, Wakanda, by the way, is a cultural appropriation. Wakanda, which means the supreme animating spirit, is a term from the Native American Indians, particularly the Lakota Sioux and other tribes. So Wakanda is not an African word, but the film Wakanda represents a myth of black achievement, a myth of a black utopian world, and so forth and so on. Science fiction films are based on myths. Most notably, of course, the Star Wars franchise. Well, that's popular mythology. It has been made up, it has been fabricated in our time. In the popular mind, a myth is, let's look back at the past now. What is a myth of the past in the popular mind? Well, it's a fake story that people made up in the past because they didn't have science and they were ignorant or undeveloped and they didn't know how things worked. So you have the myth of Prometheus describing the origin of fire. And it's conventionally convenient to say that the Greeks just made that up because they didn't know what fire was and they had to explain its origin, and so they fabricated a story which is just a superstitious fable. So there's a tendency in the conventional mind to look back at ancient myths as superstitious fables with no truth in them. I assure you that the professional mythologist doesn't regard myth in that way, and neither should you. So, what am I getting at when I use the term sacred myth? What is the significance of that qualifier? Well, there are, loosely speaking, myths that are just myths that tell a story, a narrative, and then there are myths that contain power that you can access and make your own. I might compare the two to having a bank account. You can have a bank account, and with it you get a checkbook, the way it used to be in the old days. You can tell how old I am. But if you don't have any funds in your bank account, then you can write a check, but the check is worthless. And if you try to float that check, then you are committing fraud. On the other hand, you can have a bank account, you can have money in the bank, you can write a check and use it to transact business. The sacred myth is like a bank account with money in the bank. More specifically, you can realize and utilize a sacred myth by looking at the word sacred in its root meaning. It comes from the Sanskrit root shak, which is spelled S-A-K, and that is the root of the word sacrifice, sacred, sacrilege, sacramental. Take the word sacrifice. What does sacrifice mean? It literally means an action of power, an act of power. Shak is also the root of the magnificent word in Sanskrit of Shakti. Now, Shakti means power, and specifically, it means the materializing power of the universe. So the ultimate source, the origin of the entire universe, has the power to materialize the universe. And sacred myths carry that power in a way that is transferable to those who engage the myth. Once again, speaking loosely, well, a myth is sacred in a race-specific way. Can you see that? So the Navajo creation myth is sacred to the Navajo, and the Japanese myth of origin is sacred to the Japanese, to the people who produced it. So in a loose sense, a myth is sacred if the racial group who produced it continue to preserve that myth and to revere it and hold it on the level of a religious and spiritual program. So you get the drift. In the methodology of creative mythology, and it must be right because it rhymes, you look carefully at a sacred myth and you ask the question, what kind of power is encoded in this myth, and how is it transmitted and transferred to those who follow the narrative? Now we can turn from method to material. We can apply that question to the two files on the table in front of us. There is a Semitic myth which has been created and preserved by a certain ethnic group among those who speak the Semitic languages. And yes, indeed, that myth is sacred to them. So the Old Testament is scripture, which is a term for sacred narrative. And the New Testament is scripture, the book of Revelation. All of those three documents are derivatives of the Semitic myth we're considering. Once again, when you ask the right question, it leads to a better question. This is a rule of the living gnosis. The question then would be, well, what is it exactly in the material of the Hebrew narrative that concerns power? How does it describe power? Whose power is it? And how is it available to those who follow the narrative? Not a difficult question to answer. In the Semitic myth, all power comes from El, the supreme creator God, beyond heaven and earth. And that power is transmitted through a group of deities, the Elohim, or Elohim, and it comes down somehow. Well, how does it come down? Who does it come down to? Well, it comes down to the Abrahamic peoples. Abraham is the designated patriarch of the Semitic myth, and Abraham received his power and his mission in a very particular way. I'm going to look at that incident really closely. It's described in Genesis, where you find the meeting between Abraham and Melchizedek. So Melchizedek is another figure. We're getting to the actors in the Semitic myth. It's another figure who is actually the power giver to the Abrahamic peoples, who are a specific racial lineage who hold the power of the Creator God. Well, how do they hold this power? What allows them to hold this power? Well, they preserve their lineage, they preserve their teachings, not only in the Old Testament, but in other documents and programs, such as the Torah, the Talmud, and the Kabbalah, and the Zohar. So those documents, which are in the left-hand file, are the scriptures through which the Hebrew people maintain their connection of power with their Creator God. But what kind of power is it that they have? Well, it's clearly stated in the Old Testament that they have been chosen in a special way to hold and to enact the power of Elyon. And as such, they comprise a select in-group. They alone hold that power, and all the other races, apart from them, are subject to the power that they hold. That is the mandate of the Abrahamic religions, and the origin of that mandate goes back to Melchizedek. I'll dedicate a unit to Melchizedek. Once again, the pertinent question is, well, what kind of power is it? Well, in the case of the scriptures sacred to the Hebrews, it is a power to dominate the entire world, to possess the earth, to propagate and spread across the world, to own everything, and to enslave all other races. I'm not making this up. This is stated explicitly, openly, in those documents. It's stated in many, many passages of the Old Testament. And when you look deeper into the what are called accessory documents, such as the Talmud, you find that this power to dominate all other races is emphatic in those scriptures. So in summary, you can say, based on what the scriptures themselves say, that the mandate of those who live the Semitic narrative is a mandate of domination. In plain English, power over others. Who are the others? The others are the out-group. The ones who are chosen through Melchizedek to carry out the will and program of Elyon are the in-group, and all others are the out-group, so the in-group has ultimate power over the out-group. And that is exactly, in summary, the framework and agenda of the Semitic myth. Now turn your attention to the file on the right. Let's open up that file and we find a page that has a summary of the Sophianic myth of the Aryan Caucasian peoples. Now remember, it is race-specific regarding its authorship, but those who wrote this myth, beginning with the Magian order, intended it for the entire human species. So how do they describe the origin of power in that myth, in that narrative, and how do they describe the application of power? Well, it's absolutely different. You couldn't imagine a bigger contrast between these two mythic narratives and the agendas encoded in them. Difference is that in the Sophianic myth, the ultimate supreme source of everything that exists, the originator, has the ultimate power. But the originator doesn't use its power. It doesn't exert power on anyone. By the way, this aspect of the sacred power encoded in the Sophianic myth has really close parallels in Hindu Tantra or Shaktism. And there are close parallels, there's a close interweaving in some respects between the principles of Hindu Tantra and the Sophianic message. How so? Well, the Shaktas of India, Shakta means someone who worships power, that is to say, someone who sees the true source of power and shares it, claimed that the ultimate source, which they call Parasamvit or Shiva, does nothing. Shiva is simply the beholder. And what Shiva does is it is a male connotation, delegates the power that he holds to his Shakti. And so it is the Shakti who manifests or materializes the universe, while the Shiva watches and beholds what the Shakti does. That's a beautiful principle from Hindu Tantricism, and it fits perfectly with the Sophianic paradigm. So as the story goes, and you'll find this described in the home story in the beginning of the 9 episodes, as the story goes, the originator, who is neither male nor female, delegates its power to the aeons or generators, who are gendered divinities, gendered gods. And it allows them to create with the power it gives to them, while it resides in a state of supreme beholding. So where is the originator? Well, the originator is at the source of the universe and also pervades everything that arises in the universe. But the originator doesn't act. The aeons or generators are the actors. They carry the power. And how do they express that power? How do they apply it? They most certainly do not apply it as power over others. On the contrary, they follow the example of the originator. So they offer their power to be shared by the creatures that they create in the worlds that they create. So we are now living in a world which is a real material world. It's not a dream, it's not an illusion. And this world is located on a planet in a solar system, which is embedded in the third arm of a massive 4 or 5-armed spiral galaxy called the Milky Way galaxy or the Orion galaxy. There's another difference between the Semitic myth and the Sophianic myth. The Semitic myth doesn't really locate where God is. It doesn't place Elyon anywhere that you can see. Elyon is invisible. Elyon is outside the realm of the senses. Elyon is an off-planet deity. But the aeons are actually in a material world you can locate. They inhabit the pleroma, which is a Gnostic term for the core or center of a spiral galaxy. So the aeons are materially present in the core of this galaxy. And in the limbs of the galaxy, which are vast pinwheel arms rotating, there are worlds, there are stars and planetary systems. And in these planetary systems, creatures live, different species. For instance, our planetary system on the Earth is the home or habitat of many, many species, including the human species, the anthropine species. So we are anthropines. cats are felines, dogs are canines, horses are equines, and so forth. Remember that the Gnostic name for humanity is anthropos, which encompasses both sexes. Andros is the Greek word for man, and gyne for woman. Compare anthropos with enoshut, which is the Hebrew word for humanity. And there you have a contrast. What is the purpose of enoshut? We'll get to that. And what is the purpose of anthropos? Well, the purpose of anthropos involves a power-sharing arrangement with the aeonic gods who designed anthropos in the first place. So what makes this experiment here on Earth, which is a divine experiment, interesting to the creator gods, the aeons, is first that they set up the experiment, so they want to watch how their experiment works out. But secondly, they are not omniscient. They do not control. They do not seek to dominate. They do not exert power over the experiment. Rather, they invite the anthropos in the experiment to share power with them, and in that way to determine the outcome of the experiment. Contrast that to the Semitic myth, in which Elyon has supreme control, exercised through the racial vector of the Hebrews and enacted in the world with that chosen group as proxies. Finally, to put a fine point on the contrast, it is only the in-group of the Semitic myth, those who author the myth, who are the agents of the power of the supreme God. But in the Sophianic myth, you and I, as examples or members of the anthropine species, are the agents of the power of the aeons. They offer their power in complete love and generosity and in play, by contrast to the power wielded by Elyon, which comes with serious and severe conditions, such as rules to obey, punishment, retribution, tests and trials, including a genocidal agenda. I take it the contrast between these two myths will be clear to you by now. Enough said, and I'll be seeing you in the beauty to come.